A woman auctioned off as unwanted property finds redemption in the hands of a grieving count, unaware that their love would transform not only their lives, but an entire community. Welcome to the Healed Emotions channel. Before we begin, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing deep romance stories that move hearts and heal wounds. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty plaza of Castamar, its golden rays doing little to warm the chill that had settled in Isadora Montalban's heart. At 27, she stood with her chin raised, despite the whispers that followed her every step, her amber eyes reflecting a defiance that her father's debts could not purchase. "Stand straighter," her father hissed, his weathered hands trembling as he adjusted the simple brown dress that did nothing to hide what society deemed her greatest shame. "Remember, you are still a Montalban." Isadora's lips curved into a bitter smile. "A Montalban being sold like cattle in the marketplace. How noble our name has become, father." The plaza filled with men of various stations, decadent nobles seeking entertainment, greedy merchants hunting for bargains, and widowers in need of household managers. They circled the makeshift stage like vultures, their eyes calculating, their whispers cruel. "Look at that one," someone snickered, "more suited for the kitchen than the bedroom." Another voice joined in. "What man would want such a burden? She'll eat him out of house and home." Isadora felt each word like a physical blow, but she had learned long ago that showing pain only invited more cruelty. Instead, she thought of her mother, Elena Montalban, the schoolteacher who had dared to believe that a woman's worth lay not in her waist measurement, but in the strength of her mind and the kindness of her heart. "You carry my spirit within you, Mija," her mother had whispered during her final days. "Never let them extinguish that flame." The auctioneer, a portly man with gold teeth and fewer morals, stepped onto the platform. "Gentlemen, we begin today's proceedings with Señorita Isadora Montalban, 27 years of age, from a respectable family, capable of reading and writing." "Can she cook?" someone shouted from the crowd. "Can she bear children at her age?" called another. The auctioneer's grin widened. "All questions that can be resolved through proper inspection, gentlemen. Shall we begin the bidding at 50 pesos? A heavy silence fell over the plaza. Isadora closed her eyes, feeling the weight of shame and rage pressing down upon her shoulders. This was what her life had been reduced to, a commodity that no one particularly wanted. 50 pesos, came a reluctant voice from the back. 75, countered another, more out of sport than genuine interest. As the bidding crawled upward in small increments, Isadora caught sight of a man standing apart from the others. He was tall and lean, dressed in black clothing that spoke of quality and mourning. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and his face bore the kind of lines that came from carrying heavy burdens. Unlike the others, he wasn't looking at her with calculation or mockery. He was studying her with something that looked almost like recognition. Count Alejandro de la Serna had not intended to participate in this grotesque spectacle. Political obligations had brought him to Castamar, and curiosity had drawn him to the hidden auction that the local nobility whispered about in their private clubs. He had expected to feel disgusted and leave quickly, but something about the woman on the stage held him captive. Perhaps it was the way she held her head high despite the circumstances, or the flash of intelligence in her amber eyes that reminded him painfully of his late wife, Isabella. Carmen had possessed that same quiet strength, that same refusal to be diminished by the world's cruelty. 125 pesos, the auctioneer announced with growing excitement. "Do I hear 150? The crowd had grown bored. The bidding stalled at 125, offered by a tobacco merchant known for his cruel treatment of servants. Alejandro watched as Isadora's composure finally began to crack, her hands trembling slightly as she realized what kind of life awaited her. "Going once," the auctioneer called. Something deep within Alejandro's chest stirred, a feeling he had thought buried with his wife 3 years ago. It wasn't desire or pity, but rather a recognition of kindred spirits. This woman deserved better than to be treated like merchandise, better than to disappear into a life of servitude and abuse. Going twice. 500 pesos! Alejandro's voice cut through the air like a blade. The plaza fell silent. 500 pesos was more than many men earned in a year, more than any woman at such an auction had ever commanded. The crowd turned to stare at the mysterious bidder, their faces reflecting shock and curiosity. The tobacco merchant stepped forward, his face red with indignation. 500 pesos? For that, you could buy a dozen prettier girls for such a sum. Alejandro's dark eyes fixed on the man with Arctic coldness. Then I suggest you go buy them elsewhere. The auctioneer, recovering from his shock, began to grin. 500 pesos? Do I hear 600? The silence stretched on. No one was willing or able to match such an offer for a woman they deemed unmarketable. The tobacco merchant shook his head and walked away, muttering curses under his breath. Going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman in black. Isadora felt her knees buckle as the reality hit her. She had been purchased like a piece of furniture, her entire future decided by the contents of a stranger's purse. As the crowd began to disperse, she remained frozen on the platform, uncertain of what was expected of her next. Alejandro approached the stage slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. When he reached her, he removed his black hat and offered a formal bow, the kind of respectful greeting one would give to a lady of quality, not to a purchased woman. "Señorita Montalban," he said quietly, his voice carrying a gentleness that surprised her. "I am Count Alejandro de la Serna. I realize this situation is unconventional, but I hope you will allow me to explain my intentions." Isadora stared at him, searching his face for signs of the cruel hunger she had seen in the other bidders. Instead, she found only a deep sadness that seemed to mirror her own pain. "Your intentions," she managed to whisper. "To offer you a choice," he replied simply. "Something I suspect you have not had in quite some time." As they stood there in the dusty plaza, neither could have imagined that this moment of apparent defeat would become the foundation of something far greater than either had dared to hope for. Love, Isadora would learn, sometimes arrived in the most unexpected packages, wrapped in mourning clothes and paid for with 500 pieces of silver. But first, there would be walls to tear down, trust to build, and a community's prejudices to overcome. The auction was over, but their real story was just beginning. The journey to San Teobaldo passed in uncomfortable silence. Isadora sat rigidly in the carriage, her hands folded tightly in her lap, acutely aware of the man seated across from her. Count Alejandro de la Serna had spoken little since leaving Castamar, offering only polite inquiries about her comfort and brief explanations about the road ahead. "We will arrive within the hour," he said, as the carriage rounded a bend, revealing a sprawling valley dotted with olive groves and vineyards. "I should prepare you for what you will find there." Isadora lifted her gaze from her hands to study his profile. In the afternoon light, she could see the sharp lines of grief etched around his eyes, the way his jaw tightened when he thought no one was looking. "Prepare me how?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "My estate has been quiet since my wife's death 3 years ago. The children have had only their governess and the household staff for company. They may be curious about your presence. And what will you tell them about my presence?" Alejandro turned to meet her gaze directly. "The truth, that you are a guest in our home, free to leave whenever you choose, and deserving of their respect and courtesy." Isadora felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. "You speak as though I have a choice in the matter." "You do," he said simply. "That is precisely the point." The carriage turned through an iron gate and up a winding drive lined with cypress trees. The house that came into view was magnificent, a sprawling hacienda of honey-colored stone with red tile roofs and wide terraces overlooking the valley. But there was something melancholy about it, as though the very walls mourned their mistress's absence. "It's beautiful," Isadora murmured, then immediately regretted the admission. She had no business admiring her captor's home, no matter how kindly he presented his intentions. "Isabella loved it here," Alejandro said softly. She said the light in the valley reminded her of happiness itself. As the carriage drew to a halt, Isadora steeled herself for whatever awaited inside. She had learned long ago that kindness often came with hidden costs, and she would not allow herself to be vulnerable again. A small delegation waited on the front steps. An elderly housekeeper with silver hair and kind eyes, a younger woman in governess's dress, and 2 children who hung back shyly behind the adults. "Welcome home, Conde," the housekeeper said, with a warm smile that faltered slightly when she noticed Isadora. "And welcome to our guest." "Thank you, Señora Martinez," Alejandro replied as he helped Isadora from the carriage. "This is Señorita Isadora Montalban. She will be staying with us for a time. Please see that the blue room is prepared for her and ensure she has everything she needs." Isadora caught the subtle emphasis on guest and staying with us, rather than any language that might suggest ownership or obligation. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the man's character. The older child, a boy with his father's dark hair and serious eyes, stepped forward. "Are you going to be our new mother?" he asked with startling directness. "Mateo!" the governess gasped, her face flushing with embarrassment. "That is not appropriate." "It's all right," Isadora said quickly, kneeling down to bring herself to the boy's eye level. "My name is Isadora, and no, I am not going to be your new mother. Your mother was someone very special who could never be replaced. I am simply a friend who will be visiting for a while." The little girl, who could not have been more than 3 years old, peered around her governess's skirts with curious eyes. She had inherited her father's dark hair, but possessed the most extraordinary green eyes Isadora had ever seen. "This is Helena," Alejandro said gently, scooping his daughter into his arms. "She is still learning to trust strangers." "As she should," Isadora replied, rising to her feet. "Trust is not something to be given lightly." Something flickered in Alejandro's eyes, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of the walls she had built around herself. Señora Martinez led them inside, chattering cheerfully about dinner preparations and the weather. The interior of the house was as beautiful as its exterior, with high ceilings, hand-painted tiles, and furniture that spoke of generations of good taste and care. But like the exterior, it felt somehow suspended in time, as though life had stopped 3 years ago and never quite resumed. "Your room is on the 2nd floor," Señora Martinez explained as they climbed a grand staircase lined with family portraits. "It has a lovely view of the garden, though I'm afraid the garden itself has been neglected since the Señora's passing." Isadora paused at a portrait of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, holding a baby in her arms. The resemblance to little Helena was unmistakable. "That was our Isabella," Señora Martinez said softly, following her gaze. "She had such plans for this place, always planting something, always making improvements. The Count, well, he has not had the heart for such things since she left us." The blue room was spacious and comfortable, with French doors opening onto a small balcony. But it was the view that took Isadora's breath away. Acres of overgrown gardens stretched out below, wild and beautiful in their abandonment. Rose bushes had grown into untamed tangles, herb gardens had gone to seed, and fruit trees dropped their harvest unpicked onto the ground below. "It's a shame, isn't it?" Señora Martinez sighed. "The Señora would weep to see her garden like this. But the Count cannot bear to touch anything she loved, and the gardener is too old to manage such an estate alone." After the housekeeper left, Isadora stood alone in her room, trying to process the strange turn her life had taken. 12 hours ago, she had been a commodity for sale in the marketplace. Now she was a guest in one of the finest houses in the region, with no clear understanding of what was expected of her or how long her reprieve would last. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Matteo peered around the door, his young face serious. "Señorita Isadora, Papa says you might be hungry. Would you like to see the kitchen? Cook makes the best empanadas in all of Spain." The simple kindness of the invitation nearly brought tears to her eyes. When had anyone last cared whether she was hungry? When had a child looked at her with anything other than the learned cruelty of adults? "I would like that very much," she said, surprising herself with the warmth in her voice. As she followed Matteo through the corridors of the great house, Isadora began to understand that Count Alejandro de la Serna had not purchased a wife or a servant. He had purchased her time, time to heal, time to decide, time to remember what it felt like to be treated as a human being deserving of respect and kindness. It was, she realized, the most precious gift anyone had ever given her. But gifts, as she had learned through bitter experience, always came with expectations. The question that would haunt her in the days to come was simple. What did Alejandro de la Serna expect in return for his unexpected kindness? The answer, she would discover, was far more complex and beautiful than she could have imagined. 3 weeks had passed since Isadora's arrival at the hacienda, and the household had begun to settle into new rhythms. She had established herself as neither servant nor mistress, but something indefinable, a presence that brought subtle changes to the daily life of the estate. It began with small things. Matteo, who had been struggling with his letters under the governess's rigid instruction, found himself drawn to Isadora's patient teaching methods. She had discovered him one morning in the library, frustrated and near tears over a particularly difficult passage. "Words are not enemies to be conquered," she had told him gently, settling beside him at the great oak table. "They are friends, waiting to tell you their secrets." Within days, Matteo was reading with enthusiasm that surprised his governess and delighted his father. Helena, initially shy, had begun following Isadora around the house like a small shadow, her green eyes bright with curiosity. "She speaks to them as though they are people," Señora Martinez observed to the cook one afternoon, watching as Isadora helped Helena identify flowers in the overgrown garden. "Not the way adults usually speak to children, as though they are small, foolish creatures to be managed." The cook nodded thoughtfully. "The little ones have been happier these past weeks than they have been since their mother died. Even the Count seems lighter somehow." Indeed, Alejandro had noticed the changes in his household. Laughter echoed through corridors that had been silent for too long. His children spoke animatedly at dinner, eager to share what they had learned from Isadora that day. The rigid schedule that had governed their lives since Isabella's death had given way to something more organic and joyful. But it was the morning he found Isadora in the library that he truly began to understand what she had brought to his home. He had entered quietly, intending to retrieve a book on estate management, when he stopped short at the sight before him. Isadora was seated at the large table, surrounded by stacks of books, papers, and what appeared to be a complex organizational system. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore a plain dress of deep blue that brought out the amber in her eyes. "I hope you don't mind," she said, looking up from her work with a slight flush of embarrassment. "I took the liberty of, well, the collection was in considerable disarray." Alejandro moved closer, amazed by what he saw. The library, which had been little more than a repository for dusty volumes since Isabella's death, had been transformed. Books were organized not just by subject, but by some intuitive system that made sense the moment he examined it. Damaged volumes had been carefully repaired, and she had even created a catalogue with detailed notes about each work. "You've done all this in 3 weeks?" he asked, running his fingers along the spine of a first edition that now looked as good as new. "I had help," she said modestly. "Matteo is quite good at organizing, and Helena, well, she's an excellent supervisor." "Isabella would have loved this," he murmured, then stopped, surprised by his own words. It was the first time he had spoken of his wife in the present tense, thinking of what she would have enjoyed rather than what she had lost. Isadora watched the play of emotions across his face with growing understanding. She was a reader, voracious. She said books were windows to worlds she might never see otherwise. He pulled out a slim volume of poetry, running his thumb over the worn cover. This was her favorite. She used to read it aloud in the evenings. "Would you—" Isadora hesitated, then forged ahead. "Would you like to read some of it to the children? I think they would enjoy hearing their mother's favorite verses." "Boo?" The suggestion was both painful and oddly comforting. Alejandro had avoided anything that reminded him too strongly of Isabella, but perhaps it was time to share her memory with their children rather than hoarding it like a miser guards gold. "Perhaps," he said quietly. That evening, for the first time in 3 years, the family gathered in the main salon for something other than formal meals or necessary discussions. Alejandro read from Isabella's poetry book, while Isadora worked on mending one of Mateo's shirts, and Helena played quietly with her dolls. It was domestic and peaceful in a way that made Alejandro's chest ache with both loss and unexpected contentment. This was what Isabella had always envisioned for their evenings, the family together, comfortable in each other's presence, sharing the simple pleasures of home. "Papa," Helena said suddenly, climbing onto his lap with the fearless confidence of a beloved child. "Will you read the one about the garden?" Alejandro found the poem she meant, a pastoral piece about love, growing like flowers in carefully tended soil. As he read, he found himself watching Isadora, noting the way she listened with complete attention, the slight smile that curved her lips at the more whimsical passages. When he finished, Mateo looked up from the wooden soldiers he had been arranging. "Mama liked gardens, didn't she? Like the one outside that's all wild now?" "She loved gardens," Alejandro confirmed. "She said they were proof that beautiful things could grow from the smallest seeds if given proper care. Maybe we could fix her garden," Helena suggested with the matter-of-fact tone that only children could manage. "Señorita Isadora knows about plants. She showed me which ones are herbs and which ones are weeds." Alejandro glanced at Isadora, who had gone very still. "You know about gardening?" "My mother taught me," she said carefully. "She believed that working with growing things was good for the soul, but I wouldn't presume to touch something that belonged to your wife. It doesn't belong to anyone now," he said slowly. "It's simply neglected. Perhaps it's time for that to change." The next morning, Isadora found herself in the garden with both children, armed with gardening tools that Señora Martinez had produced from some forgotten storage room. The work was harder than she had anticipated. 3 years of neglect had created a wilderness that would require patience and persistence to reclaim. But as she knelt in the earth, feeling the sun on her back and listening to the children's chatter, something inside her began to heal. For too long, she had felt like a weed herself, unwanted, taking up space that others thought should belong to someone more beautiful. Here, in this abandoned garden, she began to understand that growth and beauty came in many forms. Alejandro watched from his study window as the 3 figures moved through the garden, clearing and planning and beginning the slow work of restoration. For the first time since Isabella's death, the future seemed like something worth anticipating rather than simply enduring. He had offered Isadora a temporary refuge, but she had given him something far more valuable in return. She had reminded him that life was meant to be lived, not simply survived. The question was no longer whether she would stay, but whether he would be brave enough to ask her to. The transformation of the hacienda did not go unnoticed in the nearby town. Santeobaldo was the kind of community where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the arrival of a mysterious woman at the Count's estate provided endless fodder for speculation and gossip. It began, innocently enough, with curious questions from the shopkeepers when Señora Martinez came to town for supplies. "I hear the Count has taken in a guest," ventured Señora Vega, who ran the fabric shop, and considered herself the unofficial chronicler of local society. "Someone from Castamar? A lady who will be staying with the family for a time," Senora Martinez replied diplomatically, though she could see the hunger for details in the woman's eyes. "How charitable of him. And she's helping with the children, I suppose." "She's been very kind to them," the housekeeper confirmed, gathering her purchases with deliberate haste. But diplomacy and discretion were no match for the rumor mill of a small town, especially when fed by the malicious whispers of those who had witnessed the auction in Castamar. Word spread quickly that Count Alejandro de la Serna had purchased a woman, a fat, unwanted woman whom no respectable man would marry, and was keeping her at his estate under mysterious circumstances. The whispers grew darker and more inventive with each telling. Some said she was a witch who had ensnared the grieving widower with dark magic. Others claimed she was a fortune hunter who had seduced him with false sympathy. The most vicious rumors suggested that she was corrupting his children and desecrating the memory of his beloved wife. Alejandro first became aware of the gossip when Father Miguel, the local priest, paid him an unexpected visit on a warm Tuesday afternoon. The two men had been friends since childhood, and the priest's serious expression suggested this was not a social call. "I come as a friend, Alejandro," Father Miguel said as they sat in the study with glasses of wine. "There is talk in the town about your house guest." "What sort of talk?" Alejandro asked, though he suspected he already knew. "The kind that damages reputations and hurts innocent people. Some are saying that you have taken up with an improper woman, that you are betraying Isabella's memory." Alejandro's jaw tightened. "And what do you say, Miguel?" The priest sighed deeply. "I say that I have seen you at Mass these past weeks for the first time in months, and that your children seem happier than they have been since their mother died. I say that gossip often reveals more about the speakers than the subjects." "But," Alejandro prompted, hearing the unspoken concern in his friend's voice, "but I also say that appearances matter, particularly for a man in your position. The people need to understand your intentions, or they will invent their own explanations." That evening, Alejandro found himself walking through the garden where Isadora was working by moonlight, unable to sleep and drawn by the peaceful rhythm of her movements. She was transplanting seedlings with careful precision, her hands gentle as she settled each plant into its new home. "You shouldn't be working so late," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, brushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist. "I couldn't sleep. Sometimes working with growing things helps quiet my mind." "Is your mind troubled?" He settled on a stone bench nearby, noting how natural it felt to seek her company when his thoughts were heavy. Isadora was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. "I went to town yesterday with Senora Martinez. The way people looked at me, I know what they're thinking, what they're saying. Does it bother you?" "I've been judged and found wanting my entire life," she said with a bitter laugh. "What bothers me is that their gossip might harm you or the children. You offered me sanctuary, and I seem to have brought scandal to your door instead." Alejandro watched her face in the moonlight, seeing the pain she tried so hard to hide. "Isadora, you have brought nothing but joy to this household. My children laugh again. My home feels alive again. If that scandalizes the narrow minds of Santiobaldo, so be it. But your position in the community means nothing compared to my family's happiness." He spoke with conviction, surprising himself with the truth of it. "You have given us a gift that no amount of social approval could match." She set down her gardening tools and really looked at him for the first time since his arrival. "Why did you bid on me that day? And please don't say it was charity. I've had enough of being someone's good deed." The directness of her question deserved an honest answer. Alejandro found himself speaking words he hadn't fully formed in his own mind until that moment. "Because when I saw you standing there, refusing to let them break your spirit despite everything they were doing to you, I saw something I had lost. Courage, dignity. the refusal to be defeated by the cruelty of the world. He paused, his voice growing softer. You reminded me of who I used to be, before grief made me forget. Isadora felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking but blooming. And now, do you regret your impulse? Now I find myself wondering what I did to deserve such a gift, he said simply. Before either of them could analyze the weight of his words, the moment was interrupted by the sound of running feet. Matteo appeared around the corner of the house, his nightshirt trailing behind him and his face streaked with tears. Papa! Papa! I had the dream again! Alejandro was on his feet immediately, gathering his son into his arms. The one about Mama? The boy nodded against his father's shoulder. She was calling for me, but I couldn't find her. She sounded so sad. Isadora watched as Alejandro held his son, speaking quiet words of comfort that seemed to ease the child's distress. Her heart ached for the little boy who carried such burdens, and for the man who tried so hard to heal wounds that ran deeper than words could reach. Would it help, she said softly, if I told you a story about dreams? Matteo looked at her with curious, tear-dampened eyes. What kind of story? The kind my mother used to tell me when I had frightening dreams. She said that people who love us never really leave. They just learn to visit us in different ways. As Isadora began to weave a gentle tale about love that transcends death, about mothers who watch over their children from heaven, Alejandro found himself studying her face in the moonlight. She spoke with such tenderness, such understanding of a child's fears and needs. This was the woman the town condemned as improper, unsuitable, unworthy. Looking at her now, comforting his son with infinite patience and care, Alejandro felt something shift deep in his heart. It wasn't just gratitude or friendship anymore. It was something far more dangerous and infinitely more precious. It was love. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a sense of rightness that he hadn't felt since Isabella's death. But love, as he well knew, was not always enough to overcome the obstacles that the world placed in its path. The rumors were only the beginning. Soon, he would have to decide whether what he felt for Isadora was worth fighting for, and whether she would be willing to stand beside him in that fight. The confrontation came on a market day in late September, when the autumn air carried the scent of harvest and the promise of winter's approach. Isadora had accompanied Senora Martinez to town, despite the housekeeper's gentle protests that it might be better to send one of the younger servants instead. I will not hide away like a shameful secret, Isadora had declared, her chin set in the stubborn line that Alejandro had come to recognize as a sign of her quiet courage. I have done nothing wrong, and I will not act as though I have. The morning had passed peacefully enough. They had purchased supplies for the household and fabric for new dresses for Helena, who was growing with startling speed. Isadora had even allowed herself to enjoy the simple pleasure of selecting ribbons and threads, imagining the delight on the little girl's face when she saw the bright colors. It was as they prepared to leave that the trouble began. "Senora Martinez," came a sharp voice from behind them. "How convenient to encounter you here." Isadora turned to see a woman of perhaps 40 years, elegantly dressed in silk and lace that spoke of wealth and social position. Her dark hair was arranged in the latest fashion, and her eyes held the kind of cold calculation that Isadora had learned to recognize and fear. "Senora Delgado," the housekeeper replied with careful politeness. "Good morning." "Indeed it is." The woman's gaze fixed on Isadora with undisguised contempt. "And you must be the Count's guest." The pause before the word guest carried worlds of insinuation. Isadora felt the familiar heat of shame begin to rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to meet the woman's stare with steady composure. "I am Isadora Montalban," she said quietly. "And you are?" "Esperanza Delgado," the woman replied, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "My family has been friends with the De la Serna family for generations. I knew the late Countess Isabella quite well. The emphasis on late countess was clearly intended as a barb, a reminder of Isadora's inferior status. But it was the mention of Isabella that made Isadora's heart clench with unexpected pain. "She must have been a remarkable woman," Isadora said sincerely. "Her children are a testament to her character." Senora Delgado's eyes flashed with something that might have been surprise at the genuine warmth in Isadora's response. But she recovered quickly, her smile turning predatory. Oh, she was everything a woman should be. Beautiful, refined, devoted to her family and her social duties. She left such large shoes to fill. Her gaze raked over Isadora's simple dress and practical shoes with obvious disdain. "Though I suppose some people are content to walk in the shadows of their betters." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the tension in the air and the promise of scandal. Isadora was acutely aware of the eyes upon her, the whispered conversations, the barely concealed excitement of people witnessing a public humiliation. "I make no attempt to fill anyone's shoes," Isadora replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I am simply grateful for the kindness that has been shown to me." "Kindness," Senora Delgado repeated with a harsh laugh. "Is that what we're calling it? How generous of you to put such a charitable interpretation on the Count's impulses." The insinuation was clear and vicious. Several women in the gathering crowd gasped, while others nodded with the satisfaction of having their worst assumptions confirmed. Senora Martinez stepped forward, her usually kind face flushed with indignation. "Senora Delgado, that is quite enough." "Is it?" the woman interrupted. "I think the people of San Teobaldo have a right to know what sort of influence has been brought into their community. After all, we must think of the children." "The children are thriving," Isadora said, finding her voice at last. "They are happy and healthy and learning every day. What more could anyone ask?" "What indeed?" Senora Delgado said silkily. "Though I wonder what lessons they're learning from their father's choices. What example is being set for them about proper behavior and moral standards?" The crowd pressed closer, sensing blood in the water. Isadora felt trapped, surrounded by hostile faces and malicious whispers. This was worse than the auction, worse than any humiliation she had endured before, because now it wasn't just about her. It was about Alejandro and the children she had come to love. "You speak of moral standards," she said, her voice gaining strength from her anger. "What moral standard allows you to attack a woman who has done nothing but care for two motherless children? What refinement is there in spreading gossip and innuendo about people who cannot defend themselves?" "Cannot defend themselves?" Senora Delgado's laugh was like breaking glass. "The Count is one of the most powerful men in the region. If he chose to make his arrangements public, that is his choice. But those of us who cared about his wife's memory have every right to question." "You have no right!" The words burst out of Isadora with a force that surprised even her. "You have no right to speak for the dead, no right to use a good woman's memory as a weapon against the living. Isabella de la Serna loved her children more than anything in this world, and she would be appalled to see her memory twisted into something cruel and small." The crowd fell silent, shocked by her passionate defense. Even Senora Delgado seemed momentarily taken aback by the fire in Isadora's amber eyes. "How dare you speak her name?" the woman hissed. "You, who have come to take her place." "I have taken no one's place!" Isadora's voice rang out across the plaza. "I am not trying to replace her. I am not trying to be her. I am simply a woman trying to live with dignity and kindness, trying to help two beautiful children heal from their loss. If that offends your sensibilities, then perhaps you should examine what your sensibilities truly value." Before Senora Delgado could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the plaza. The crowd turned as one to see Count Alejandro de la Serna riding toward them, his black stallion moving with urgent purpose. His face was a mask of controlled fury as he took in the scene. Isadora standing defiant in the center of a hostile crowd, Senora Martinez hovering protectively nearby, and Esperanza Delgado with her lips curved in a satisfied smile. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots striking the cobblestones with a sound like a judge's gavel. The crowd instinctively stepped back, recognizing the authority in his bearing and the dangerous glitter in his dark eyes. "Senora Delgado," he said, his voice carrying the chill of winter winds, "how illuminating to find you here, entertaining the townsfolk with your wisdom." "Count de la Serna," she replied, though some of her confidence seemed to waver under his steady gaze. "I was merely expressing concern for your welfare and that of your dear children." "Were you indeed?" He moved to stand beside Isadora, not touching her but close enough that his protection was unmistakable. "And what conclusions did your concern lead you to?" Senora Delgado straightened, clearly believing she held the moral high ground. "That a man of your position should be more careful about the influences he allows into his household, for the sake of Isabella's memory, if nothing else." The mention of his wife's name in such a context made Alejandro's jaw tighten visibly. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of warning that made several people in the crowd shift nervously. "My wife's memory," he said slowly, "is not yours to invoke, and my household is not yours to question. But surely you must see—" "What I see," he interrupted, his voice cutting through her protest like a blade, "is a woman who has made my children happier than they have been since their mother died. What I see is someone who has brought light and laughter back to a house that was drowning in grief. What I see is a lady of true refinement, the kind that comes from character rather than circumstance." The crowd murmured at this unexpected defense. Several people looked ashamed, while others seemed disappointed that their entertainment was being spoiled. Senora Delgado's face flushed red with humiliation. "You cannot be serious. She was sold at auction like a common—" "She was rescued from an injustice," Alejandro said firmly, "and I would do it again 1,000 times over. The only shameful thing about that day was that such a spectacle was necessary at all." He turned to address the crowd directly, his voice carrying clearly across the plaza. "Let me make something perfectly clear to all of you. Señorita Montalban is under my protection and is to be treated with the respect due to any lady of quality. Anyone who chooses to ignore this will answer to me personally." The threat was delivered quietly, but its impact was unmistakable. Alejandro de la Serna was not a man to cross lightly, and his influence extended far beyond the boundaries of his estate. "Furthermore," he continued, "I find it curious that people who claim to value morality and propriety would gather like vultures to feast on gossip and innuendo. Perhaps you would benefit from examining your own behavior before presuming to judge that of others." With that devastating observation, he offered his arm to Isadora. "Shall we return home? I believe the children are expecting us for lunch." Isadora took his arm gratefully, her legs still trembling from the confrontation. As they walked toward his horse, she could feel the eyes of the crowd upon them, could almost hear the furious recalculation of gossip and speculation. "Thank you," she whispered as he helped her onto the horse before mounting behind her. "You defended yourself magnificently," he replied, his breath warm against her ear. "I was proud to witness your courage." As they rode away from the plaza, Isadora allowed herself to lean back against his solid warmth, drawing comfort from his strength. But even as relief flooded through her, she knew that this was far from over. They had won this battle, but the war for acceptance and respectability had only just begun. And in the days to come, they would both learn that some enemies were far more dangerous than malicious gossips in the town square. The real test of their growing bond was yet to come. The weeks following the confrontation in the plaza brought an unexpected peace to the hacienda. It seemed that Alejandro's public defense of Isadora had quelled the worst of the gossip, though whispers still followed them whenever they ventured into town. More importantly, It had shifted something fundamental in their relationship, a recognition that they were no longer simply a host and his grateful guest, but allies bound together by mutual respect and growing affection. October arrived with the promise of rain, and with it came changes that neither Isadora nor Alejandro could have anticipated. The children had fully embraced Isadora's presence in their lives, with Helena insisting that bedtime stories were not complete without Señorita Isa's gentle voice, and Mateo proudly showing off his improved reading skills to anyone who would listen. "She makes everything better," Helena announced one morning as Isadora braided her dark hair before breakfast. "Mama used to make things better too, but now she lives with the angels. So God sent us Señorita Isa instead." The innocent observation brought tears to Isadora's eyes, not of sadness, but of wonder at the resilience of children and their capacity to love without reservation. She had never imagined that she could feel so needed, so genuinely cherished for who she was, rather than what she could provide. Alejandro had observed these changes with growing amazement and something deeper, a recognition that what he felt for Isadora had moved far beyond gratitude or friendship. He found himself looking forward to their evening conversations in the garden, to the sound of her laughter mixing with his children's voices, to the way she hummed softly while working among the flowers they had planted together. The restored garden had become a symbol of their unlikely partnership, where once there had been only neglect and decay. Now neat rows of vegetables grew alongside carefully tended flower beds. Isadora had discovered that she possessed not only her mother's knowledge of plants, but also an intuitive understanding of how to create beauty from chaos. "Isabella would have loved what you've done here," Alejandro told her one evening as they walked among the autumn chrysanthemums. "She always said that gardens were a collaboration between human hope and divine grace. I think about her sometimes when I'm working here," Isadora admitted. "I hope she doesn't mind that I've changed some things. I think she would be grateful that someone is caring for what she loved," he replied softly, "just as I am grateful that someone is caring for those she loved most." Their eyes met in the fading light, and for a moment the air between them seemed charged with possibility. But before either could speak, the spell was broken by Mateo's urgent voice calling from the house. "Papa! Papa, come quickly! Helena is sick!" They ran toward the house, their hearts pounding with parental fear. They found Helena in her bedroom, burning with fever and crying for her mama in the delirious way of sick children. The local doctor was summoned, but his grave expression offered little comfort. "It's the autumn fever," he said, washing his hands in the basin that Señora Martinez had provided. "It's been going through the villages. She's young and strong, but—" He shrugged in the helpless way of medical men faced with illness beyond their understanding. For 3 days, Helena's fever raged. Isadora barely left the child's bedside, cooling her burning forehead with damp cloths and singing the lullabies her own mother had sung to her. Alejandro maintained his vigil as well, reading stories in his deep voice and holding his daughter's small hand in his larger ones. On the 3rd night, as rain began to fall in earnest against the windows, Helena's fever finally broke. She opened her green eyes and smiled weakly at Isadora, who was dozing in the chair beside her bed. "Señorita Isa," she whispered, "did the angels bring the rain?" "Yes, mi corazón," Isadora replied, tears of relief streaming down her face. "They brought the rain to wash away your fever and help you get well." "I knew they would," Helena said with perfect 3-year-old confidence. "Mama told them to take care of us. She told them you would help." It was then that Isadora truly understood what had happened to her heart during these months at the hacienda. She loved these children as if they were her own. She loved their father with a depth that frightened and exhilarated her. She loved this life they had built together, imperfect and uncertain as it was. But love, as she had learned through bitter experience, was often not enough to overcome the obstacles that the world placed in its path. The test of that love came sooner than any of them expected. It was a stormy afternoon in early November when young Matteo's passion for horses nearly cost him his life. He had been practicing his riding in the paddock near the stables, eager to impress his father with his improved skills. But a sudden crack of thunder spooked his mount, sending the boy tumbling to the ground with a sickening crack that echoed across the courtyard. Isadora was in the garden when she heard the commotion, shouts from the stable hands, the frightened neighing of horses, and underneath it all a child's cry of pain. She ran toward the sound without thinking, her heart in her throat, as she saw Matteo lying motionless in the mud. "Get the doctor!" she shouted to the nearest servant as she knelt beside the boy. His left arm was bent at an unnatural angle, and his face was pale with shock and pain. "Mama," he whispered, and Isadora's heart broke at the confusion in his young voice. "I'm here, mi amor," she said softly, though she was not his mother and might never have the right to claim such a role. "I'm here, and everything will be all right." But the doctor was in the next village, tending to another emergency. The rain was falling harder now, turning the roads to rivers of mud that would be treacherous for any horse and rider. Matteo's arm needed immediate attention, or the damage might be permanent. Without hesitation, Isadora made a decision that would change everything. "Saddle the fastest horse," she ordered the head groom. "I'm going to fetch Dr. Herrera myself. Señorita, you cannot ride in this storm." "I can and I will," she said, with a firmness that brooked no argument. "That child needs medical care, and I will not stand by and do nothing." The ride to the village was a nightmare of mud and lightning, rain that blinded her and winds that threatened to tear her from the saddle. But Isadora pressed on, driven by love for a child who had become as dear to her as any son of her blood could be. She found Dr. Herrera preparing for bed, his day's work apparently finished. But one look at the mud-covered, rain-soaked woman on his doorstep was enough to galvanize him into action. "How bad is it?" he asked as he gathered his medical supplies. "His arm is broken," she gasped, still breathless from her desperate ride. "He's in terrible pain, and I'm afraid we'll save the arm," the doctor said with professional confidence. "You did right to come for me immediately." The return journey was no less harrowing, but now Isadora had the doctor's calmer presence to anchor her courage. They arrived at the hacienda to find Alejandro in the grip of paternal terror, pacing the length of Matteo's bedroom, while the boy drifted in and out of consciousness. "Thank God," he breathed when he saw them. "I've been going mad with worry." Dr. Herrera took charge with practiced efficiency, setting Matteo's arm and administering laudanum for the pain. But it was only after the boy was resting comfortably that Alejandro truly looked at Isadora, muddy, exhausted, her hair hanging in wet tangles around her face, her dress torn and stained from her ordeal. "You could have been killed," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I wasn't," she replied simply, "and Matteo will be fine." "You rode through a storm for my son." "I rode through a storm for our son," she corrected without thinking, then froze as she realized what she had said. The words hung in the air between them, honest and revealing and impossible to take back. In that moment, both of them understood that whatever careful boundaries they had maintained, whatever polite fiction of her temporary residence they had constructed, had been swept away as completely as if by the storm itself. "Isadora," Alejandro said softly, stepping closer until they were breathing the same air. "Do you know what you've just said?" "I know what I've felt for weeks," she replied, meeting his gaze with the courage that had carried her through the storm. "I know that I love your children as if they were mine. I know that I love this life we've built together, and I know that I love you, even though I have no right to say so." "No right?" His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears she didn't realize had begun to fall. "You have every right in the world. You've earned it through love and sacrifice and 100 small acts of kindness that have transformed our lives." "I'm not beautiful," she whispered, voicing the fear that had haunted her since childhood. "I'm not refined or graceful or any of the things a man like you should want." "You're wrong," he said fiercely. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever known, because your beauty comes from here." He placed his hand over her heart, and here, his fingers touched her temple gently. "You've made me remember what it means to be truly alive." And then he was kissing her, soft and reverent at first, then with growing passion as she melted into his embrace. It was a kiss that spoke of months of suppressed longing, of recognition and acceptance, and the promise of a future neither had dared to imagine. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Alejandro rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said simply. "Not because of obligation or convenience, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." "The scandal," she began. "Let them scandalize," he interrupted. "I've lived in the shadows of other people's expectations long enough. I want to live in the light of your love." Before she could respond, a small voice came from the doorway. "Are you going to be our new mama now?" They turned to see Helena standing in her nightgown, her green eyes bright with hope and excitement. Behind her, Matteo was leaning heavily on his governess, his arm in a sling, but his face eager with anticipation. "Would you like that?" Isadora asked gently, kneeling to bring herself to their level. "More than anything," Matteo said solemnly. "You already love us like a mama should. And you already make Papa happy again," Helena added, with the devastating honesty of childhood. Isadora looked up at Alejandro, seeing her own wonder reflected in his eyes. 6 months ago, she had been a commodity for sale in the marketplace, unwanted and unloved. Now she was being offered everything she had ever dreamed of: love, family, a place where she truly belonged. "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of hope. "Yes, I will marry you." As Alejandro lifted her to her feet and spun her around while the children cheered, Isadora felt something settle deep in her soul. She had finally found her home, not in a place, but in the hearts of the people who loved her for exactly who she was. But even in the midst of her joy, she knew that their battle was far from over. Love had conquered doubt, but it would take more than love to overcome the social forces that would try to tear them apart. The real test of their commitment was yet to come. News of Count Alejandro de la Serna's engagement to Isadora Montalban spread through the region like wildfire, carrying with it a mixture of shock, outrage, and barely concealed satisfaction from those who loved a good scandal. The announcement, made formal through a notice in the regional newspaper, sent ripples through the carefully stratified society of the area. Esperanza Delgado read the announcement over her morning chocolate, her face growing paler with each word. The idea that the common woman she had publicly humiliated was now to become a countess was almost beyond comprehension. But worse than her personal mortification was the realization that her own matrimonial ambitions, carefully nurtured since Isabella's death, had been definitively crushed. "It cannot be allowed to stand," she declared to her brother, Don Carlos Delgado, a man whose wealth and influence had bought him considerable power in regional politics. "The very idea is monstrous. A woman purchased at auction, becoming Countess de la Serna. It makes a mockery of everything our society holds dear." Don Carlos, a calculating man who never acted without considering multiple angles, leaned back in his chair thoughtfully. "And what do you propose we do about it? Alejandro is within his rights to marry whomever he chooses." "Rights?" Esperanza spat. "What about his responsibilities? His duties to his class, to his children's future, to the memory of Isabella? This creature will destroy everything the family stands for. Or," her brother said slowly, an idea beginning to form, "we ensure that she never gets the chance." Meanwhile, at the hacienda, preparations for the wedding were proceeding with quiet determination. Alejandro had decided to hold the ceremony at the estate's private chapel, limiting the guest list to close friends and family members who could be counted upon for their discretion and support. Isadora found herself overwhelmed by the kindness of those who truly mattered. Father Miguel had agreed to perform the ceremony, declaring that he had never seen Alejandro happier or more at peace. Señora Martinez and the household staff were beside themselves with joy, having watched the transformation of their beloved family with wonder and gratitude. Even more touching were the letters that began to arrive from unexpected quarters. Former students of Isadora's mother wrote to congratulate her, sharing memories of Elena Montalban's wisdom and kindness. Several of the rural families whose children Isadora had taught during her months at the estate sent simple gifts and heartfelt wishes for her happiness. "You see," Alejandro said one evening as they sat reading these letters together, "the people who matter understand what you truly are. But the people who don't matter can still cause considerable damage." Isadora replied with practical wisdom, "I'm not naive about what we're facing." She was proven right sooner than either of them expected. The first blow came in the form of a visit from Don Carlos Delgado, who arrived at the hacienda with an official air and a document case that suggested serious business. Alejandro received him in his study, noting the man's cold demeanor with growing wariness. "I come on a matter of some delicacy," Don Carlos began without preamble. "There are concerns about your intended marriage that extend beyond mere social propriety." "What sort of concerns?" Alejandro asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Legal ones?" Don Carlos withdrew a sheaf of papers from his case. "It has come to my attention that your fiancé's father died with considerable debts still outstanding. Debts that, under law, could be considered the responsibility of his heir." Alejandro felt ice form in his veins. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that several creditors have been reminded of amounts still owed by the Montalban estate, amounts that total nearly 3,000 pesos. Don Carlos smiled with predatory satisfaction. Of course, if Señorita Montalban were to quietly withdraw from the region, these debts might be forgotten. But if she remains, if she marries into a prominent family and gains access to significant resources— "You bastard," Alejandro said quietly. "This is extortion." "This is business," Don Carlos corrected, "and a kindness, really. I'm offering your friend a chance to disappear before these debts become a public scandal that would destroy your family's reputation. And if I choose to pay these convenient debts myself, that is your right, of course. But I wonder how many more might surface. Memory can be a fickle thing, and record-keeping in small villages is often incomplete." The threat was clear. They could manufacture debt indefinitely if necessary. After Don Carlos left, Alejandro sat alone in his study, staring at the papers that threatened to destroy his newfound happiness. 3,000 pesos was a significant sum, but not beyond his means. What troubled him was the implication that this was just the beginning, that his enemies would continue to find new ways to attack Isadora until they succeeded in driving her away. He found her in the garden, working among the late autumn flowers with Helena chattering beside her. The sight of them together, his daughter completely at ease with the woman who had become her second mother, strengthened his resolve. "We need to talk," he said quietly, and something in his tone made Isadora look up with immediate concern. That evening, after the children were in bed, he told her about Don Carlos's visit and the threats that hung over their future. To his surprise, she received the news with calm composure. "How much?" she asked simply. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me. How much do they claim my father owed?" 3,000 pesos. "But Isadora, that's not the point. Even if we pay this, they'll find other ways to attack us." She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the garden they had restored together. "Perhaps I should leave," she said finally. "No." The word came out with more force than he had intended. "I won't let them drive you away with threats and lies. But if my presence brings scandal and debt, then we'll face it together." he said firmly, taking her hands in his. "I told you once that you have the right to choose. I meant it, but I also have the right to fight for what I love, and I choose to fight for you." Before she could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats in the courtyard. A messenger dismounted and hurried to the door, bearing urgent news that would change everything. Word had reached the capital about the Count's controversial engagement. More importantly, it had reached certain political circles where Alejandro's family name still carried weight and influence. A letter from the governor himself requested Alejandro's presence in the capital for consultations about his marriage plans. The message was clear. Powerful forces were aligning against them, forces that could make or break Alejandro's position in society and potentially threaten his custody of his own children. "They're not just trying to separate us," Isadora said with bitter understanding. "They're trying to destroy your entire life." "Then we'll have to be stronger than they are," Alejandro replied, though he could feel the weight of the forces arrayed against them. The next morning brought another unexpected development. Father Miguel arrived early, his usually serene face troubled with urgent concern. "My children," he said, "I bring news that may change everything. There has been pressure from the bishop regarding your marriage, questions about the propriety of the union, demands for delays and investigations." Alejandro felt his heart sink. "Are you saying you cannot perform the ceremony?" "I'm saying that if we're going to do this, it must be now, before they can formally forbid it." The priest's eyes twinkled with something that might have been mischief. "I believe I may have accidentally misplaced the bishop's letter for a few days, long enough, perhaps, for two people who love each other to be properly married." Isadora looked between the two men, understanding dawning in her amber eyes. "You're both willing to risk your positions, your futures, for my happiness." "For love," Father Miguel corrected gently, "for the belief that love blessed by God should not be destroyed by the petty cruelties of men." And so it was decided. The wedding would take place the next day, in the small chapel of the hacienda, with only the household staff and the children as witnesses. It would be simple and private, but it would be legal and binding, a fact that would make it much harder for their enemies to tear them apart. As the sun set on what might be their last evening as an unmarried couple, Alejandro and Isadora walked once more through the garden they had created together. Tomorrow, whatever came, they would face it as husband and wife. "Are you frightened?" he asked softly. "Terrified," she admitted, "but also grateful. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. Now I realize it was just beginning. Whatever happens," he promised, "we'll face it together." Neither of them knew that their enemies had one final card to play, one that would test their love more severely than anything they had yet endured. But they would learn soon enough that love, while powerful, sometimes required the courage to make sacrifices that seemed impossible to bear. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, with November sunlight streaming through the windows of the hacienda's chapel. Isadora stood before the small mirror in her room, adjusting the simple white dress that Senora Martinez had helped her alter from one of Isabella's gowns, a gesture that had initially seemed inappropriate until she realized it was the older woman's way of giving the union her blessing. "Mama would have wanted this," Helena had declared, with the absolute certainty of childhood when she saw Isadora in the dress. "She told me in my dreams that she's happy you're going to be our new mama." Now, as Isadora prepared to walk down the aisle of the small chapel, she wrapped her mother's quilt around her shoulders, the same patchwork covering that had been her only inheritance and her greatest treasure. It seemed fitting that both mothers, living and dead, should be represented at this moment of new beginnings. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Senora Martinez with some final adjustment to her dress. Instead, Mateo peered around the door, his young face solemn with the weight of some important mission. His arm was still in a sling from his riding accident, but he carried himself with newfound maturity. "Papa sent me," he said importantly. "He wanted you to have this before the ceremony." He handed her a small velvet box that she recognized immediately, Isabella's jewelry case. Inside, nestled in silk, was the Della Serna family ring, a beautiful sapphire surrounded by diamonds that had been worn by Alejandro's mother and his wife before her. "But this belongs to Isabella's memory," Isadora protested gently. "Papa says it belongs to the woman who loves us," Matteo replied with simple wisdom. "And that's you now." With trembling fingers, Isadora slipped the ring onto her right hand, where it caught the light and seemed to welcome her into a lineage of love that transcended death itself. The chapel was small but beautiful, filled with the warm light of candles and the scent of flowers from the garden. The household staff had gathered as witnesses, their faces beaming with genuine joy. Father Miguel stood at the altar in his finest vestments, his eyes twinkling with satisfaction at the small rebellion he was staging against church politics. But it was the sight of Alejandro that took Isadora's breath away. He stood waiting for her in a dark suit that emphasized his tall frame and distinguished bearing, but it was the expression on his face that made her heart race, wonder, love, and a joy so profound it seemed to transform him from the grief-stricken widower she had first met into a man reborn. As she walked down the short aisle, arm in arm with both children who had insisted on escorting her, Isadora felt the weight of the past months settle into perspective. Every humiliation, every moment of doubt, every tear shed in loneliness had led to this moment of perfect belonging. The ceremony itself was simple but profound. Father Miguel spoke of love that transcended social expectations, of families formed by choice rather than blood, of the courage required to build happiness in the face of the world's disapproval. "Do you, Alejandro, take Isadora to be your wife, to love and cherish in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Alejandro replied, his voice strong and certain as he slipped a gold band onto her finger. "Do you, Isadora, take Alejandro to be your husband, to love and cherish, in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, for as long as you both shall live?" Isadora looked into the eyes of the man who had given her back her dignity, her purpose, her very life. "I do," she whispered, then louder, "I do. Then by the power vested in me by God and the Holy Church, I pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." As Alejandro lifted her veil and kissed her gently, Isadora heard the cheers of the household staff and felt the small hands of the children tugging at her dress in excitement. She was no longer Isadora Montalban, the unwanted woman sold at auction. She was Isadora de la Serna, countess and beloved wife and mother, but their joy was interrupted by the thunder of hoofbeats in the courtyard outside. Through the chapel windows, they could see a party of horsemen approaching, official-looking men in uniform, who clearly meant business. Don Carlos Delgado dismounted from the lead horse, his face grim with purpose. Behind him came 2 constables and a man Alejandro recognized as a clerk from the regional court. "It seems our enemies have not given up," Father Miguel observed quietly. Alejandro squeezed Isadora's hand reassuringly. "Whatever they want, we'll face it together. You are my wife now, and nothing they can do will change that." They walked out to meet the delegation, Alejandro's arm protectively around his new bride's waist. Don Carlos stepped forward with officious formality. "Count de la Serna, I regret to interrupt your festivities, but I come on official business." "What business?" Alejandro demanded. "A formal complaint has been filed regarding the legitimacy of this union," the clerk announced, producing a scroll sealed with official wax. "Questions have been raised about the bride's debts, her character, and her fitness to become a member of a noble family." "The marriage has already taken place," Father Miguel interjected firmly. "It is legal and binding before God and man." "Perhaps," Don Carlos said with a cold smile. "But there are also questions about the bridegroom's fitness as a guardian, concerns about the influences being brought into the household, the effect on the children's moral development." The threat was clear. They were prepared to challenge Alejandro's custody of his own children if he persisted in this marriage. "You go too far," Alejandro said dangerously. "Do I? A man who marries a woman of questionable character, who exposes his children to scandal and impropriety." Don Carlos shrugged with false regret. "The court might well decide that such children would be better served by more suitable guardians." Before anyone could respond to this monstrous threat, another party of riders appeared on the horizon, but these approached at a more leisurely pace, and as they drew closer, Alejandro recognized the livery of the governor himself. Governor Don Eduardo Vasquez, dismounted with the dignity befitting his office, his weathered face unreadable as he surveyed the scene. He was followed by his aide and a small escort of soldiers. "Your Excellency," Alejandro said, bowing formally. "This is unexpected." "Indeed," the governor replied, his keen eyes taking in the wedding party, the official delegation, and the obvious tension in the air. "I came to investigate reports of irregularities regarding your marriage, Count de la Serna. But it appears I have arrived just in time to witness something far more interesting." Don Carlos stepped forward eagerly. "Your Excellency, if I may explain the situation—" "You may not," the governor cut him off with icy authority. "I am quite capable of assessing the situation myself." He walked slowly to where Isadora stood, still in her wedding dress, with her mother's quilt around her shoulders. For a long moment, he studied her face with the penetrating gaze of a man accustomed to reading character. "You are the famous Isadora Montalban," he said finally. "I am Isadora de la Serna now, Your Excellency," she replied with quiet dignity. "Indeed you are." He turned to address the assembled crowd. "I have spent the past week investigating the circumstances surrounding this union. I have spoken with merchants who know the bride's character, with families whose children she has taught, with servants who have observed her conduct in the Count's household." Don Carlos shifted nervously, sensing that events were not proceeding as he had planned. "What I have found," the governor continued, "is a woman of unimpeachable character who has brought nothing but benefit to everyone whose life she has touched. I have found children who speak of her with genuine love and respect, servants who praise her kindness, and merchants who testify to her integrity." He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering the decisive blow. "I have also found evidence of a conspiracy to manufacture debts and spread malicious gossip for the purpose of destroying this woman's reputation and preventing her marriage." His cold gaze fixed on Don Carlos. "Evidence that points directly to certain individuals who seem to believe that their personal preferences outweigh the law of the land." Don Carlos went pale. "Your Excellency, I can explain—" "You will have ample opportunity to explain yourself to a magistrate," the governor said curtly. "Guards, place this man under arrest for fraud and conspiracy." As the soldiers moved to apprehend Don Carlos, the governor turned back to the newlyweds with a slight smile. "Count de la Serna, Countess de la Serna, I wish you both great happiness in your marriage. And I look forward to meeting your children, who are fortunate indeed to have gained such a loving stepmother." The transformation was complete and magical. In a matter of minutes, they had gone from facing social ruin to receiving the highest official blessing their union could hope for. As Don Carlos was led away in chains and his delegation retreated in confusion, the wedding party found themselves laughing with relief and amazement. "How did you know?" Alejandro asked the governor as they walked back toward the house. "I make it my business to know the truth about people in my region," the governor replied with a knowing smile. "And the truth about your wife is that she has done more good in 6 months than most people accomplish in a lifetime. The rural schools speak of her volunteer teaching, the poor families praise her generosity, and even the merchants who once gossiped about her now defend her character." He paused to look at Isadora with genuine respect. "Moreover, I knew your mother, Señora de la Serna. Elena Montalban was one of the finest teachers in the province. Her reputation for integrity and wisdom was legendary. It seems those qualities run in the family." Tears sprang to Isadora's eyes at this unexpected tribute to her mother's memory. "You knew her. She taught my own nephew when he was struggling with his letters. She never accepted payment, said education was a gift that should be freely given." The governor's expression softened. "When I heard that Elena Montalban's daughter was being persecuted by small-minded bigots, I knew I had to intervene." As the official party prepared to depart, the governor offered one final piece of wisdom. Countess, you will find that scandal dies quickly when replaced by respectability. Live well, love openly, and let your actions speak louder than your critics' words." The days that followed their wedding seemed like a dream to Isadora. The news of Governor Vasquez's public blessing of their union spread rapidly through the region, effectively silencing the gossips and social climbers who had hoped to profit from their misery. Don Carlos Delgado's arrest on charges of fraud had shocked the local nobility into reconsidering their positions, and several families who had been coldly distant now sought to curry favor with the newly vindicated countess. But the most meaningful changes were the ones that took place within the walls of the hacienda itself. Mateo and Helena had embraced their new mother with the wholehearted enthusiasm of children who had been starved for maternal love. They called her Mama Isa now, and her heart swelled each time she heard the precious words. "I used to dream about Mama Isabella," Helena confided one evening as Isadora braided her hair before bed. "But now I dream about both my mamas together, and they're both smiling." The healing extended to Alejandro as well. The guilt and grief that had shadowed him since Isabella's death had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something gentler, a sweet melancholy that honored the past while embracing the future. He spoke of Isabella more freely now, sharing memories with the children and including her naturally in their family conversations. "She would have loved you," he told Isadora one evening as they walked through the restored garden. "She always said that the best people were those who made others feel valued for who they truly were." "I hope I can live up to that standard," Isadora replied, still sometimes amazed by the life she had been given. "You already do, every day." December brought the first winter rains, and with them a delegation that neither Alejandro nor Isadora had expected. Father Miguel arrived one afternoon, accompanied by a travel-worn man who introduced himself as Padre Sebastian from the village of Castamar. "I bring greetings from many families in our village," the priest said, his weathered face kind but serious, "and a request that may surprise you." They gathered in the main salon, where a fire crackled warmly in the hearth and the children played quietly with their toys nearby. "The families whose children, Señorita, forgive me, Countess Isadora, taught during her time with us have not forgotten her kindness," Padre Sebastian explained. "Many of those children can now read and write because of her patient instruction. Their parents have saved what little they could, and they wish to establish a small school in her honor." Isadora felt her heart swell with emotion. "That's very kind. But surely they need their money they need education for their children," the priest interrupted gently, "and they need someone who understands their struggles to help guide this project. They are hoping you might consider serving as the school's patron and occasional teacher." The request was both humbling and exciting. Here was a chance to honor her mother's legacy while making a real difference in the lives of children who had so few opportunities. "I would be honored," she said, looking to Alejandro for his approval. "We would be honored," he corrected, placing his hand over hers. "The De la Serna family will be proud to support such a worthy cause." As winter deepened into the new year, the school project became a family passion. Helena insisted on helping to sew curtains for the schoolroom windows, while Mateo carefully copied out letters of the alphabet to serve as teaching aids. Alejandro provided not only financial support, but also used his influence to secure proper books and supplies. The school opened in the spring, housed in a small building that had been donated by a reformed merchant who had once participated in the cruel gossip about Isadora. The opening ceremony was attended by families from throughout the region, and Governor Vasquez himself came to deliver the dedication speech. "Education," he declared, "is the greatest gift we can give our children. And this school, founded in love and maintained by sacrifice, will serve as a beacon of hope for generations to come." As Isadora watched the first group of students file into their new classroom, she thought of her mother and the dreams that had been passed down through generations of strong women. Elena Montalban's daughter had traveled a difficult path to reach this moment, but every step had been worth it. The final vindication of their love came that autumn, exactly 1 year after their wedding. Esperanza Delgado, whose brother remained in prison and whose family fortune had been devastated by the scandal, appeared at the hacienda gates one crisp October morning. She looked older, her once proud bearing diminished by circumstances and genuine remorse. Isadora received her in the formal parlor, curious about what had brought her former tormentor to seek this audience. "I have come to apologize," Esperanza said without preamble, her voice barely above a whisper, "and to beg your forgiveness for the cruelty I showed you." Isadora studied the woman who had once tried to destroy her happiness, seeing not an enemy, but simply another human being who had lost her way. "What has brought about this change?" she asked gently. "Prison," Esperanza replied with bitter honesty. "When my brother was arrested, I lost everything: my social position, my marriage prospects, my family's wealth. I learned what it feels like to be judged and found wanting, to be treated as less than human because of circumstances beyond my control." She raised her eyes to meet Isadora's gaze directly. "I spent this year working as a governess to survive, caring for other people's children, and watching how love truly works. I saw the difference between affection earned through kindness and obedience forced through fear, and I realized what a fool I had been." "And what do you want from me now?" Isadora asked, though her tone held no hostility. "Nothing," Esperanza said simply. "I want nothing except to tell you that you were right and I was wrong. You have proven that worth has nothing to do with appearance or social standing. You have built a life filled with love and meaning, while I destroyed my own through petty jealousy and malice." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Your children are fortunate to have you as their mother, and your husband is fortunate to have you as his wife. I hope someday I might be worthy of the example you have set." After she left, Isadora sat in the parlor for a long time, contemplating the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been a commodity sold at auction, unwanted and unloved. Now she was a beloved wife and mother, a respected member of society, and a woman whose very existence had helped to change other lives for the better. That evening, as she and Alejandro walked through the garden they had restored together, she shared the story of Esperanza's visit. "Do you forgive her?" he asked. "I think I do," she said slowly. "Hatred is a burden I no longer wish to carry. She caused me pain, but that pain led me to you and to this life we've built together. In a strange way, I'm almost grateful to her." "You continue to amaze me," Alejandro said, stopping to take her in his arms. "Your capacity for forgiveness, your ability to find meaning in suffering, these are gifts that I treasure more than any title or fortune." "And you gave me the greatest gift of all," she replied, reaching up to touch his face tenderly. "You gave me the chance to choose my own life, to love and be loved for who I truly am." As they stood together in the moonlight, surrounded by the flourishing garden that symbolized their love's triumph over adversity, Isadora reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had learned that love was not about being chosen, but about choosing to love in return. She had discovered that beauty came in many forms, and that the most lasting beauty grew from character and kindness rather than physical perfection. Most importantly, she had found that home was not a place, but a feeling, the security that came from being utterly accepted and cherished for exactly who you were. From the house behind them came the sound of children's laughter as Matteo and Helena played some evening game with their governess. The sound filled Isadora's heart with perfect contentment. These were her children now. This was her husband. This was her life, built not on the shifting foundations of social approval, but on the bedrock of genuine love and mutual respect. "What are you thinking about?" Alejandro asked, noting the peaceful expression on her face. "I'm thinking about choices," she replied softly. "A year ago I thought my life was over because I had no choices left. But really, the most important choice was still ahead of me. The choice to accept love when it was offered, to believe that I deserved happiness, to have faith that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. And now I choose to love you more each day. I choose to be the best mother I can be to our children. I choose to use whatever gifts I have to make the world a little brighter for others." She smiled, her amber eyes sparkling with joy. "I choose to be happy, Alejandro. After so many years of simply surviving, I choose to truly live." As if summoned by their contentment, Helena appeared at the garden door in her nightgown, her dark hair tousled from play. "Mama Isa, Papa, come see what we found." They hurried inside to discover that Matteo had been exploring the library and had found a hidden compartment in Isabella's writing desk. Inside was a leather journal filled with her thoughts and dreams for her family's future. With trembling hands, Alejandro opened to a random page and began to read aloud, "I pray that if anything should happen to me, Alejandro will not let grief consume him. I pray that he will remember that love is meant to be shared, not hoarded. I pray that my children will know the joy of a mother's love, even if that mother is not me. And I pray that whoever comes into their lives will see them as I do, as perfect, precious souls deserving of unlimited love and endless possibilities." Oh, the words hung in the air like a blessing from beyond the grave. Isabella had somehow known that love would find its way back to her family, and she had left her permission and encouragement for that love to flourish. "She knew," Isadora whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Somehow she knew." "She knew," Alejandro agreed, pulling his wife and children into his arms. "And she approved." As the family stood together in the warm circle of lamplight, surrounded by the evidence of lives well lived and love freely given, Isadora understood that she had finally found what she had been searching for all her life without even knowing it. She had found home. And in that home, in the hearts of the people who loved her unconditionally, she had discovered the most profound truth of all, that every person, regardless of their appearance or circumstances, deserved to be chosen, cherished, and celebrated for the unique gift they brought to the world. The auction that had seemed like the end of her story had actually been its beginning, and what a beautiful story it had turned out to be.